Today we're going to look at the most radical movement of the 20th century. And you're going to have to kind of suspend your disbelief to comprehend the movement. It happened against the backdrop of the First World War, basically founded by draft dodgers that came from all over the European continent to neutral Zurich, Switzerland. This amazing photo collage is called Krieg und Leichen, die letzte Hoffnung der Reichen, War and Corpses, Last Hope of the Rich. And it's a hyena, and it's overlooking no man's land between the barbed wire fences of the Allies and the Central Powers that divided Europe during those 4 years of the First World War. A war that is particularly interesting, I think, from our standpoint today, because it was a reaction against an irrational war of aggression in which the only higher truth was kind of taking over land and war profiteering. And I think this collage works beautifully for it. So different than the collages of Picasso and Braque that we looked at earlier that were more aesthetic. These are photo montage, a type of art that was contributed by the Dadaists. And his name is John Hartfield, which was Johannes Herzfelder, but out of protest for his disgust with a German nationalism and jingoism that was so rampant, he changed it to an anglicized name, John Hartfield, and that's what he's known as. It's quite a defiant thing when your nation is in war with another nation to anglicize your name. It's a political sort of thing. It's a hyena, which is this terrifying dog-like creature that lives in packs in West African savannas. And it's called a laughing hyena because in the evening, the kind of nocturnal animals, as the sun is setting over the savannah, you hear these things. They sound like mad women laughing hysterically. And they're very vicious creatures. This one, walking over corpses in no man's land between the trenches, sports an expensive silk top hat and is decorated with a Maltese cross for war valor, another slap in the face of German nationalism. Okay, so fasten your seatbelts. Oh, I wanted to say that I didn't wear my tie today because I'm in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And I hope, I wish them the very best, and inspired by the president, I'm wearing my green t-shirt. That's how confusing it is. Art needs an operation, writes Tristan Sara, the nom de plume of Sammy Rosenstock, one of the main players in Dadaism. Dadaism was the most radical movement of the 20th century, and it was born during the First World War, and its initial center was in Zurich. So to understand Dadaism, because it's not a very aesthetic movement, it's not a movement where you see beautiful colors like Matisse or charming sort of play of form like you have in Picasso and Braque and the Futurists. Instead, it's deadly earnest about the immediate conditions of the world. It was formed in the middle of the First World War at a time when it was feared that this war could be a modern 100 Years' War, because trenches reached from the English Channel right to the Alps, and very little movement was made until the very end when the war collapsed. So what we need to do is to first of all understand World War I. And World War I is very, very, very different than World War II in this regard. World War II had clear moral imperatives. If I would have, I'd like to think that if I lived during that period, it wouldn't have to be drafted, I would have enlisted, not because I'm a warmonger, but because Hitler had to be stopped. It was just absolutely necessary. So I think the moral imperative was very clear. It was very clear who were the good guys and who were the bad guys in the Second World War. And history has validated our own moral position during that war. The First World War was very, very morally ambiguous. What were we fighting for? what is the cause here? Why am I shooting at this person because someone was assassinated in some place far off called Sarajevo? So let's first of all look at the causes. But the most important thing I want you to keep in mind is the irrationality of the war, of the moral ambiguity, of trying to figure out who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And the Dada is just cut out entirely. Okay, so let's look at the war. This is the map on the eve of the war, and it looks pretty much like our map today, except the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is a gigantic state, as big as Germany and just as old, a culture. But unlike Germany, unlike France, unlike Russia, unlike Spain, unlike the United Kingdom, Austro-Hungary was a multi-ethnic, multi-language entity. It had a lot of different speaking people, not only the German speaking Austrians and the Magyar speaking Hungarians, but also these people in the eastern regions that were Slavic peoples. And they had many different languages and many different customs, and they were all kind of put together into this jigsaw puzzle of Austro-Hungarian thing. And this was unresolved. How do these states in the eastern part of the empire, how do they achieve their own freedom, their own autonomy from this larger, what they saw, in some people saw, as an oppressive government? The Austro-Hungarian Empire had already annexed this area here along the Adriatic Sea, Bosnia-Herzegovina. This had been part of their empire. All of these states had been part of Turkey's Ottoman Empire, but one by one, starting with Greece and going to Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth, had broken away from the Ottoman Turks and had declared their own independent nations. Bosnia, however, Bosnia-Herzegovina, was annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was feared by some of these other states, like Serbia and Romania, that maybe their next thing would be to invade Serbia and to annex, Romania. And they wanted their own ethnic place. And so this guy, the Archduke Ferdinand, no kid, he's the prince, the crown prince, but he was in his 60s. His father, the Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled from Vienna, was in his 80s, 90s maybe even. And actually, I think Archduke Ferdinand had a goodwill mission. He went on a mission in the eastern part of the empire to encourage them to remain part of the empire and to not annex themselves, because he felt strongly that they could not be economically self-sufficient without the entirety of the empire. I don't know if that's really true. I don't know much about economics. That was his idea. He was basically, I think, a good guy. He said, when I get into power, which is not going to be too long from now, because the Franz Joseph is very old and ready to call it quits, then he was really trying to do a goodwill mission to these eastern provinces, even promising them a certain level of autonomous self-rule as part of the empire. So that was his kind of propaganda mission, goodwill mission. And he was a good guy. And it really is unfortunate that he was assassinated by a Serbian rebel, a teenager, when he was visiting Sarajevo. And he was in an open motor car. And here he is in his, minutes before his assassination with his wife. Now, what made okay, so what happened then was I'm trying to make this as simple as I can because it's kind of complicated. It was like a house of cards all collapsing in on itself. Serbia, the rebel was from Serbia, right? This teenager, and they captured him and they brought him back to Vienna. Serbia said, bring him here, but people were very reluctant to trust Serbia because Serbia seemed to be kind of exporting terrorism, encouraging acts of defiance in the eastern part of the empire. So, and Serbia is right next to the annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. So Serbia, they did not trust Serbia. So they know he's going to be, this kid is going to be tried in Vienna, but they suspected that the Serbians were behind it. even though the kids said no one sent me, they believe they were. So they demanded of Serbia that they go in and do an investigation. And Serbia says, with all due respect, we are a sovereign nation and we're not going to let you come in. We'll do an investigation. We'll report to you. And they said, no, because we don't trust Serbia to do, the fox can't protect the chicken coop. We don't trust something coming out of Serbia. So they gave him an ultimatum. They said, like 78 hours. And if you don't give us free access, we'll invade Serbia and then we'll just do our own investigation anyway. And Serbia was, of course, terrified because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was huge. So it called on its ally, the Russians, who are also, Slavic peoples. And Russia, as you remember, is quite a bit bigger. And Russia said if Austria invades Serbia, Russia will declare war on Austria. Now, Austria can handle an invasion of Serbia, but this is a long frontier along the Russian border. And even though Russia was not a very militarized society, nor very technologically advanced, still they had a lot of people, and it was kind of terrifying. So Austria then called on Germany and said, if we have to invade Serbia and if Russia declares war on us, will you declare war on Russia? And they said, we will. We're also German-speaking people. We're sympathetic, and mostly Germany said they were not going to stand for terror. They were not going to stand for people assassinating people. Remember, the American president had been assassinated, McKinley, and these kind of things were happening, and they felt like no more terror. Terror is not a diplomatic thing. We're going to stamp out terror, and so we stand on that side. Now, Germany was the most technologically advanced, militarized society with, transport, with battleships in the North Sea. It was ready to roll. And Russia then, of course, freaked out because Germany is really way scarier than Austria. And so then now it starts getting real weird. Russia activates an alliance with France. So the birthplace of the democratic revolutions, in Europe, Paris, does a deal with the most most backward kind of political system in Europe. And so they're very unusual, partners. And they thought, we'll just kind of squeeze these central powers. They were called the Central Powers because they kind of central Europe. And so, once everybody had declared war on everybody, Spain was neutral, and at first England was neutral. And England, people were the French and the German, that whole Allied side was really terrified that a combination of the English and the Germans would be undefeatable, because the way the Germans ruled militarily, the United Kingdom ruled the seas, and they had, ship power. And if there was and the Queen of England was German, right? That's dynasty of the Windsors is German, right? Prince Albert was a German prince, a consort of Queen Victoria. So there are very long traditions of friendliness between the Germans and the English, not so with the English and the French, who have fought for centuries. So they decided to stay neutral, as was the United States, as was Spain. But so Germany thought, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fight this to end terrorism for all time. We're going to not worry about the Eastern Front because Russia is still trying to get its boots to everybody. So we're going to turn all our forces on the West, and we're just going to come through like this and take over Paris and take over France. And the war will be over by Christmas. And so they launched an attack, and they asked, the only thing, Paris around here, the difficulty in this Silesian plan to invade France is that Belgium was in between. And so they said, they sent, very polite Germans, that we have no quarrel with Belgium. We respect your neutrality, but we want to march through on our way to take over France. And Belgium said, with all due respect, we are a sovereign nation. And we'll see this as an invasion and an act of war if you step one boot in Belgium. And Germany went, well, whatever. And they just marched right through Belgium. And the Belgians really, really fought. It reminds me very much of the of our own day. But they were no match for the German army machine. And they did a lot of destruction in Belgium. But the most disastrous thing, in a way, for Germany was now it brought England into the war. So now in England on France's side, which is really an unusual combination. We're used to it now because they've been allies for so long, since the Second World War. But at this time, they were very different sort of nations. And so once the United Kingdom had entered on that side, on the Allied side, they were pretty much matched as far as power. And so what happened was, it was a trench warfare, affected very much by the new technology of death that was made available, the machine gun and the submarine. The machine gun, and so because machine guns could just mow down a whole bunch of people, you couldn't do charges the way you used to do in the old days. And so instead, there were trenches that were dug, and people were put up in the trenches on the French side, French-English side, and on the German side, taller than your head, and they would have a machine gun overlooking that, and then barbed wire, and then no man's land, and then the trenches on the other side. It was very hard to do an all-out frontal assault because you would just be mowed down by the machine guns. But nonetheless, there were sometimes those sort of things. But what happened was, and this is what was really terrifying, far from being over that first Christmas, it seemed to have reached a stalemate where although the trenches moved a little bit to one side or a little bit to the other side, it was almost like, the line of scrimmage in a football game. It was a matter of yards or hundreds of yards. And it seemed like an unwinnable war. Okay, so this is the situation that we have. And gas masks, they figured out, they put gas into no man's land. And the wind is right, it will affect the other side and make them sick or kill them, blind them, so they had to wear gas masks. Here's one of the trenches. Okay, so this is the background. The submarine, the Unterwasserboot, the U-boat in German, it was a German invention, and it could go, underwater. It's a very sneaky sort of thing because they had no sonar, they had no way of detecting it. So, and the other bad thing about a U-boat, and they invented this so they could go under the British blockade, without being seen stealthily. But the morally bad thing about the U-boat is you couldn't take survivors. In the old days, when you would sink a ship, you'd sink the ship and then you would send out lifeboats and you'd get the people off the boat as it slowly sank. Big boats take a long time to sink, and they put in the life and then you bring them over to the ship and you put them in the brig, and they're prisoners of war. That's the kosher way. That's the accepted diplomatic, gentlemanly way of war. But the Unterwasserboot couldn't do that. There was no space. It only holds like 12 or 15 men. And even there, they're just this little thing. If you ever want to see a good movie, Das Boot from the 80s about some U-boat, it's a German movie. I think for the Second World War, but it gives you that claustrophobic feeling. And so that was why when the Lusitania was sunk, it brought America into the thing as well. Okay, so you see this background. The clearest thing about it is, and of course the German thing is, morally, the Germans had said, okay, we're fighting this to end terrorism. And then they invade Belgium, right? Which was interpreted as a terrorist act on a national level, national terror. So here, the hypocrisy of the Germans trying to win a war against terrorism and using terrorist methods to achieve these ends. It just seemed also morally bankrupt. So these people from all over Europe, artists, young people, poets, and so forth, immigrated to Switzerland, especially to the capital of Zurich, where it was cheap and you could live. And amidst all this, in the Spielgasse, in the working class district, was the Cabaret Voltaire. And it was founded by a German expressionist poet named Hugo Ball, who, although he has a very, stern expression and looks older than his age, he was really only about 25 at this point. He was a poet and he could also play piano. And he was the one who kind of founded the Cabaret Voltaire. He said that we'll have nightly performances of the latest art from all over Europe because they were these international group of artists, poets, dancers, and so forth. And Hugo Ball was the kind of serious, always clad in black. almost like a priest. Then his wife was Emmy Hennings, and she did these wonderful puppet shows. And she was also a cabaret singer. So she was, she combined those things, those talents. But one of her other talents and some of these puppets actually still exist. It's incredible. That is the little paper mache puppets. But she would do whole political things, using the puppets. In neutral Zurich, you could criticize the war in a way that you couldn't openly do in any place else. And she could sing, and but she also had another talent, that was forging passports. She could forge papers. She was really, really good at it. And so a lot of the daughters were able to come to Zurich by the forged passports and papers that Emmy Hennings had originated for her. This is the Spielgasse, and this is the place that was and it's still there, that was the Cabaret Voltaire, that existed for really only a little bit of time. And it was founded during the second year of the war, when it really seemed that this might not ever be over, that this might become the permanent state of Europe, that just young men are just put into this grinding machine. And as the war went on, they had to draft younger and older men. So by 1918, Germany was drafting boys as young as 15 and as old as 60. All those were draftable men by the end of the war, because the people between 20 and 30 had mostly been dead or blown up or whatever, shell shock. Post-traumatic stress disorder really began to be recognized during this period. So here is a painting by Marco Ianco, and I suppose I should have put the name up there. Ianco was from Romania, as was Tristan Sara, and he did this kind of cubist interpretation of the Cabaret Voltaire. It no longer exists. It's like a lot of Dada's things. They were ephemera that were at the moment they were there, you had to be there, and then they disappeared. So all we have is a black and white picture of it, but it's using, the language of cubist form that he gets from Picasso and Braque, but now shown the crazy antics. There's Hugo Ball, the dark, tall pianist, Emmy Hennings, other people, posters all over, from all over Europe, an interesting clientele. A cabaret is different than a theater, there are tables and you can order drinks and smoke cigarettes and some light food, as well as entertainment. And they did nightly entertainment that was very, very strange, and very much a criticism of the absurdity of the war and of nationalism in general. So there was a feeling of international solidarity that they tried to express in these crazy things. This is Sophie Tauber Arp, and we'll come back to her, but she was part of the Laban dancers who first started they developed a way of annotating dance that was not ballet, that was closer to modern dance in the post-war era, and there were Laban dancers in Zurich, and she was one of them, but she was also a school teacher, and that was her main thing. Now, when the Cabaret Voltaire became famous or infamous for its political gestures, principal told her that if you want to keep this job, you will not perform at the Cabaret Voltaire anymore. So after that, she always had to be masked, because she didn't want to lose her job, but she wanted to continue, and this is one of her dance pieces. Incredibly, a few of these little paper things made out of paper bags survived. And there was a great show about 2010 at the Museum of Modern Art that really brought together Dadaism, the movement, in a way that very few movements have been brought together, and largely as a result of Stephen C. Foster's G.K. Hall project that I was privileged to be part of. This is Hugo Ball dressed as kind of a bishop. He wrote a diary called Flight Out of Time, and it's out of print, but you can find it at the library. And he comments on what they're trying to do here, saying it's kind of a high mass of absurdity of the war and so forth. Now, what I want to do is, and I hope you'll allow me this, I want to read a poem by Jean Arp, or Hans Arp. He was actually from Alsace-Lorraine, and he was both drafted into the German and the French army. And instead, he came to Zurich. And when he was in Zurich, he was a small man. He was married to Sophie Tauber, who did the dance. And he had a tailor friend, and they got a French and a German uniform, military army uniform, cut them in half and then sewed them together with a hat and everything. And he would walk around Zurich saluting people and stuff, half German, half French, which brought him to the attention of the German authorities. And so they called him down to the German consulate and said, like, you know, you have to appear, you have to tell me why, you know, you're 19, 20, something like that. He was a very young man. All these were very young men and women. And they called him down to explain why it is that he's not in Germany and why he's not draftable. And so what he did is, according to his story, he took, he had the tailor take out his wife's wedding dress so that it would fit him. And he went down dressed as a bride, saying, you know, I'm here to serve the fatherland, sir, you know. And they said, well, there are, perhaps it would be better after all if you were made in neutral Zurich. Now, we don't have any photographs of that. The wedding dress and the you know, the uniform do not longer exist, but we know only of them in this. And this was a magazine that they, and this is by Arp, this little abstract design. But I would like to read a poem that it was a little later, but by Jean Arp, and it's called The Great Unrestrained Sadist. And I think it will give you a flavor of the type of performances that were happening there at the Cabaret Voltaire. I'd like to dedicate it to Premier Putin. The Great Unrestrained Sadist by Jean Arp. Before his immense window, high as a cathedral window, the great unrestrained sadist vibrates like an electric filled with a rubber of nothingness. The great unrestrained sadist is stark naked and rubbed all over with phosphorus, which makes him decorative and macabre. His eyes and his long womanly tresses are as white as curry-combed air. His face is proud and ruthless, like the faces of all the truly great sadists who are stylized, certified, and eligible for government pensions. The great unrestrained sadist does not deign to eat his perfumed thyme in extinct grass, to wear the rosy white gloves of those who carry their ransom in a litter of depraved light. No, he vibrates like an electric gut stuffed with a rubber of nothingness. I said, I repeat it, and I shall repeat it as often as is necessary. He is impatient to continue his august task or his elfiness task, however you want to christen it. The domestics are already arriving with crocodiles, grandmothers, dandies, airplanes, flies, etc., and putting them down before the great window. In a diabolical and remunerated elan, with the joyous cry of a Tyrolean defenestrator dancing around a lake of dirty grease, he pounces upon the piled up objects and hurls them out of the window of sublime works. He spends his whole life hurling everything in existence out of the window, even takes whole live elephants and hurls them out of the window. Quack, 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 beg the gallant but terrified elephants. The great unrestrained sadist refuses to stop in his venerable elan. Anything his, dead or alive, sweetened or salty, heavy or light, servants bring him, he hurls out of the windows. Cigars, navies, apartments, railroads, regular coffees, sex appeals, houses, mushrooms, etc. The window is high enough to let the falling objects change into orange marmalade. And billions of little children come swarming like flies to lick it up with their little mouths. The little children joyfully clap their hands and cry, marmalade, 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 up to the window of the great unrestrained sadist. And without respite, over and over again, he hurls pianos, zeppelins, monuments, diplomats, etc. out of the window. He foams, perspires, grinds his teeth, and realizes that he must outdo himself and crown his already inconceivable labor. Not having anything else at hand, he pulls out his white hair, his hands, his feet, hurls them out of the window, and finally hurls anything remaining of himself out of the window, uttering a dreadful shriek. And after his fall, changes, like all the other objects, and to the great delight of the billions of little children, into orange marmalade. Have to be in the spirit of the time to get the implications of it. they were closed several times because sometimes fistfights and stuff would break out. It was a very, very packed sort of the moment thing. I wanted to mention one thing about the Cabaret Voltaire before moving on, because Hugo Ball ended his career at the Cabaret Voltaire only after 6 months, even though he was the founder of it. And that's during this performance, people started catcalling and throwing things at him. And he was reading one of these absurd poems, and the voice took on the sound of the Roman Catholic, you know, la da 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 da, that kind of thing. And he was carried off. He said transformed into a magical bishop. And after that, he cut his relationships with Dadaism, moved to an obscure Italian part of Switzerland, and wrote a life of the Byzantine saints. When he died, he was revered as a saint in the 1930s. He's one of the strange cases of Dadaism, and there's very little left that we really have that's concrete from this time. But we have to kind of imagine it. Another thing I wanted to mention here was among the denizens of the Cabaret Voltaire's nightly raucous performances were a number of Russians, and some of them who did that dance where you get down, you do that sort of stuff. And in fact, da, according to some, da, meaning yes, 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 in Magyar, in Slavonic languages, including Russian, that it was yes, yes. So despite their negative attitude toward the war that was erupting all around them, and which seemed absurd and to have no moral basis whatsoever, except just pure human aggression, and among their denizens, and among those Russians, was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who lived in a small apartment right directly across the street from the Cabaret Voltaire. And we can only imagine him coming to the Cabaret Voltaire and beginning to think, wow, modern art is really radical. And I'm going to remember that if I ever come into power. And of course, when he did come into power, he did officially make modern art the official art of the fledgling Soviet Union. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. But I want to remind you that this is kind of where it all began. After Hugo Ball left to pursue his vocation as a Catholic mystic, Tristan Sara from Romania, Sammy Rosenstock, he took that name from Tristan and Isolda, and he wore a monocle the way aristocrats do. He was 19 years old when he arrived there, and he really made transformed the small kind of crowds that were local from Zurich, although they were international. He really made the international connections by a series of letters and poems and publications that circulated throughout these other Dada centers during the period. This was a building in which, in the first floor, there was a gallery, the Gallery Dada, where they continued with the performances even after the Cabaret Voltaire. After Hugo Ball left the Cabaret Voltaire, Dada kind of became more international in the hands of Tristan Sara. Here are a couple of the publications with illustrations by Hans Arp, by Jean Arp on the cover. I love that name, Arp. It just sounds so Dada. So here you can see it's in French. It's in several different languages. One of the things they said in the Cabaret Voltaire, there were often these things that were a mixture of French and German language that that they could get by the censor from doing. Here's Jean Arp on the left, sticking his tongue out with Tristan Sara and Hans Richter, who was very interested in animation and did some of the first abstract kind of animation and was also an expressionist from Germany. Hans Richter, though, also wrote one of the most interesting books on Dadaism, because he was really there from the very beginning, and it's called Dada, Art and Anti-Art, and I think it was published in the 1960s when he was an old man, and it's a wonderful way to just get a lot of these stories out of it. It was a great early anthology that influenced me a lot when I was a young man. So here is Hans Arp kind of playing fun with Tristan Sara's monocle. He's the one that dressed in the soldier's uniform and who wrote The Great Unrestrained Sadist. He's noted for these wonderful sort of biomorphic forms. That is, instead of hard geometric forms, that the Cubists, for example, were using, or the Futurists at the time. He was more given to these soft and organic forms that almost resemble clouds or microscopic sort of things, although sometimes they do have references to the real world. This is not a painting. This is a wood construction made of different pieces of wood in on a jigsaw. It's small, and it's a moonlit night. In here is one with a navel in it. And he often has these things that really seem like, that they could be living sort of creatures that exist under the world. He translates that also into 3 dimensions, and he writes a lot of poems, including the great unrestrained sadist, but others as well, all through his long career. And he said he sometimes feels like, as a sculptor, that he's aiming at clouds and shooting them and bringing them down where they roll around and then calcify into marble. And he does these wonderful marble sculptures that are just, I almost can't, I have a hard time not touching them because they just are so sensuous with their openings and so forth, so much like biomorphic forms as well. Here, look at this one called Transformation or Changes, I believe, and it's a bronze. So he usually works in marble or wood. During the Cabaret Voltaire, was a lot of performance art and stuff like that. It's only later, as he matured as an artist, that he was able to do this sort of stuff. And it really does suggest an organic kind of growth, because he says art is a seed, and it should be allowed to grow into whatever shape it takes. And it doesn't necessarily have to have the shape of something from the real world. It can be a manifestation of the inner soul of the artist. His wife was Sophie Tauber-Arp, the subject of a recent exhibition as well, along with many other women artists of the early 20th century. She's coming into the spotlight. She, as I mentioned, was just as successful as a dancer, but she was basically a school teacher. So that teaching aspect was always important to her. And here she is behind kind of a head, and she has some things painted on her face as well. She is into crafts, and she does, for example, textile weavings. And here she combines they're more geometric in form than her husband's work, but still has a wonderful harmony and sense of balance and order and so forth. So there's nothing particularly even Dadaist about it. And it's hard to put your finger on what exactly is Dadaism and what isn't. But this is a textile that she did during this period. Here's another one. We're more used to abstraction. This in 1915, this was very radical sort of stuff, and more needs still to be talked about probably with her. After the war, Dadaism spread to all these different centers, because remember, the people that were there were from France, from Germany, from America, from Spain, from all over the world, from Russia, from all over the world. When war ended and these people went back to their own countries, they brought Dadaism, and it sort of flourished like a spore or something in these different places, because there was a great deal of dissatisfaction after the war on everybody's part, not only the Germans, who were asked to pay a very debilitating war reparations, so that they were not able to do and thrust their country into deep economic recession. And Berlin, now we have to talk about Dada not as an encompassing movement. We talk about Zurich Dada that really ends with the war, and as people return to their countries. None of them, I don't think, stay in Zurich. But there is a center in Berlin, in Cologne, in Hanover, and in Paris, as well as Barcelona and New York City. So we'll see how far we can get in the next 20 minutes. As I said, it's a really complicated movement, and it's hard to kind of get your grasp of, because it's such an elusive sort of phenomenon, a kind of the moment kind of happening. But it definitely does have a political engagement. And Berlin Dada, much more than even Zurich Dada, and certainly much more than Paris Dada or New York Dada, had a radical political agenda. And they aligned themselves with the Communist Party in Germany. And so they were very heavily Marxist. And they had a Club Dada in Berlin following the war. Now, the end of the war happened in 1918, and they call it the November Revolution, sometimes, to compare it to the October Revolution of the year before in Russia. And the November Revolution in Germany was precipitated with a mutiny of sailors on the North Sea, especially stationed outside of Kiel. And it quickly spread because what they were, the high command at the moment that Germany was sending ambassadors to talk about a peace, right, brokered by Wilson and others. That very moment, the German high command ordered a suicide attack by the warships. The warships had been, these big warships had been kept in the North Sea all during the war because they couldn't be launched against the British who were blockading, and the British would have destroyed them. And that's why they developed the submarine. So all these warships have never left the North Sea. Suddenly, at the very end, in November, they say, launch a frontal attack on Britain. It was a suicide mission. And the sailors said, no, we're tired. We're not going to do that. And they, in fact, they had a mutiny. They arrested the high command. They had trials on the ship. They took down the German flag and they put up the red flag, of communism. And they said, we are the sailors' commune of Germany. And of course, the Kaiser in Berlin was terrified by this, and he sent a battalion of the National Guard to the north to put down the rebellion. And the National Guard fraternized with the mutineering sailors, and they united as these communist sailors and soldiers who mutineered against the war, and they marched on Berlin, demanding end of the war, and the Kaiser fled to Holland, and it was the end of the Second Reich. It was a very messy sort of ending, and Berlin was occupied by these communist sailors during those first months after, and it was such a difficult situation to have Berlin be occupied by Germans, but communists who had hoped to push the November Revolution to become, a Soviet-style government like the Russians. Okay, so that's what Berlin was like right after the war, and in fact, but there was a more moderate. Most of the people were more moderate than that. They wanted some sort of monarchy, not a monarchy. They wanted a democracy based on the American Constitution, but Berlin was too hot. Too full of communist sailors. They felt sort of threatened. So the delegates met instead in Weimar, the sleepy little town of Goethe, and they hammered out a constitution that was based on the American Constitution. And they proposed that and was voted on, and it became what we call the Weimar Republic. That lasted from 1919, the spring of 1919, when the Constitution was ratified, through the end of the Republic in 1933, when Hitler was named chancellor. The Nazis never really won. Anyway, here are some of the protests in Berlin at the time near the Brandenburg Gate. And here we have a redrawn map. Here's before with this huge Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now that's been broken up into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, parts of, and Poland, which was not part of anything before. So that's, everything was kind of redone. Germany was facing great chaos. And the people who had swept into power, voted into power, were socialists and union people who had never really run a government. They had been, and so they really didn't know how to manage things, and they just printed up more money. And so there was an incredible inflation that went from like 4 marks to $1 at the beginning of the war to like millions, literally millions of marks to $1 by 1921. Right? And the socialists were kind of moderate because they were trying to moderate between the more radical communists and the more conservative liberals. But in 1922, there was another election, and they put in a moderate, Stresemann, and he did some economic miracles. And part of the economic miracle, certainly for Germany, was the friendship of American investors, because American investors realized that Germans are very industrious people and that they can make a lot of profit. So they heavily, and once there was afraid there was going to be a communist revolution, they were reluctant to invest because, communists nationalized industry. But now there was a moderate dedicated to a constitutional republic, they were more than willing to put their money behind German industry. And so we were very great friends of Germany, and they really loved, in the 1920s, they loved as they do now, love American music and love American dress and all that sort of stuff. They kind of, and I'm proud to say that we never signed the Treaty of Versailles. That put on such a kind of a impossible war reparations onto Germany, and is largely seen as the beginnings of fascism, was like this unfair treaty. America didn't have any part, we didn't want any reparations from the Germans at all, and we invested heavily in German industry, making possible the economic miracle of the 1920s, which they call the Golden 20s. Like we call it the Roaring 20s, they call it the Golden 20s, because once Stresemann was in, and he didn't die until 1928, leave office till 1928. He was an economic miracle worker. I don't know. Okay, so let's keep going with Club Dada. As I said, it's a very kind of busy movement with a lot of different headed hydra. But we'll make it through as much as we can. We want to at least finish German Dada here. George Gross, and here he is, was a member of the Club Dada. He actually did this cartoon for a German newspaper that become them censored. And it's Christ, being crucified with war boots and a gas mask to show the sort of crucifixion of the working class people. Here he does a political cartoon that basically says, okay, and the physician, stethoscope to the chest of a cadaver, claims him, ready for active service. I think it's called ready for active service. And these idiotic, hairy-knuckled, military people. It's a very damning sort of thing. There were a lot of war casualties after the war. And the most horrible thing about it was, why did we do this? What was the objective here? And it was very, very unclear what was really going on during the First World War. And really a map was redrawn, but those were minor sort of things. George Gross really goes for the horror in the aftermath of this greatest war that had ever been, and that didn't seem to make any sense for anybody. And there were lots of people like this, that then there wasn't really enough money for them to be real safety net, despite the fact that socialists were in power. There were a lot of people reduced to like begging, like this man who's also lost part of his face. It's horrible. Raoul Hausmann, one of my favorites. He sports a monocle like Tristan Sara. Radical communists, a lot of relationship to the constructivists in the Soviet Union. And he does these collages, which are unlike Picasso and Braque's collages in that they were used images in them. And up here you can see, for example, Dada. This one's called Tatlin at Home. And Tatlin was one of the great Russian communist sculptors, abstract sculptors, who was a commissar of art during the first years after the Soviet Union under Lenin. And he was seen as kind of a hero in Germany by these German communists. And so this is a portrait of him with all these different sorts of machine sort of things going on. He really has this wacky kind of sense of chaos, and it really is very eye-catching work that's made from the refuse of society. Also, this photo montage, this type of collage, photo montage, was also used, and this is Raoul Hausmann here, this photo of him there, as the cover for Dada magazine that was published by the Berlin Dada. Another was Hana Hook, and that O should have an umlaut, but I couldn't figure out how to make an umlaut with two dots over it. Hana Hook was one of the female Dadaists associated with Berlin Dada. her work has been come under some scrutiny in the last 5-10 years as monographs have begun to investigate, because she lives to like the 1970s and does interviews. But this is one of her most famous pieces, and I suppose I should have put the title on, but it's called Cut with a Kitchen Knife Through the Beer Belly of the Weimar Republic. And it's this, big collage that uses all these different images. But what's really, you don't see until later is there's this montage of photos that becomes Kaiser Wilhelm, who had abdicated at the end of the war. And he has this mustache that goes up like this. And so here you can see his face and that mustache and, anti-Dada and all these machine things. It's a very kind of strange, cacophonous world that she creates that's pokes fun at German nationalistic pretensions from a leftist point of view. But I think the most brilliant of the Berlin Dadaists, for my money, is John Hartfield, who, as I said, had anglicized his name in the middle of the war against the English to John Hartfield, a name that stuck. And he continued to live in Germany after the Second World War and continued to be involved with communism there, even though it had largely turned its back on modern art by that time. Here's one of him, a self-portrait cutting off the head of the mayor of Berlin in a picture, with that serious look. He's the one that gave us this wonderful, War and Corpses, Last Hope of the Rich, in his brutal attack again. Now, this was not made with Photoshop. This is all taking photos and very cleverly and very skillfully cutting them and pasting them, and then using airbrush so that it doesn't look cut up and fractured, to make a kind of smooth, continuous image, and then he'd re-photograph it. So that and the names were often on it. Shows the viciousness of the bourgeois class. He did a lot of interesting stuff, as I said, all with airbrush and so forth. He wasn't able to use. You didn't have the computer programs they have nowadays. But here are these these warplanes, and you notice the double wings, because it's from the era of the First World War when they had biplanes, and the smoke trails that they leave kind of form a huge hand with bodies on the bottom and bombed out buildings there. And this is what much of Germany and Belgium, my God, they just really had destroyed Belgium. Here he's talking about the bourgeois magazines, Blind, the person, and this guy's in a straitjacket with these newspapers around his head. Again, it's a set up thing. He didn't, I don't think, take this from a magazine or anything. I think he set it up. But there, as you can see, the cut marks. Later on, when Hitler began to rise, and he does actually begin to have a following after the 1922 so-called beer hall putsch, where they took over the government of Munich for 30 minutes or something like that, a bunch of Nazi drunk thugs. But anyway, Hartfield was a real thorn in the side of Hitler, who, of course, famously hated modern art. Look at this one. It's called Nur keine Angst, ist vegetarian. Don't worry, he's a vegetarian. And here he is, with a blood-splattered apron, sharpening his knife, in the presence of a cock who, instead of having a cock's comb, has the Phrygian cap of the French Revolution. And he's hungrily looking at France. It's a very damning thing. And here's AIZ Arbeiter International Journal, Workers International Journal, came out of Berlin, and this is now, early 30s. And so we're kind of after Dadaism is over, but I do want to follow up because some of his most brilliant work is this anti-Nazi stuff that he does. This one's called The Meaning of the Hitler Salute, right? He said, and this big fat banker with millions of marks is handing to Hitler while he does this. And it says below there, millions stand behind me. Small man asked for a big handout. And of course, there were scathing articles from a communist point of view in this magazine. Then there was the crowning kind of achievement of Berlin Dada was the International Dada Exposition of 1921. kind of a swan song of the movement, because, you know, Dadaism almost needed the war to react against. It was so much a movement that was uh, opposed to the reigning paradigms of the day and the reigning sort of mentality, uh, that it didn't survive the war all that long. Except in Paris, where it kind of morphed into surrealism and went on for another 20 years, but under different aegis at that point. And we'll look at Paris Dada perhaps in a whole separate thing. You know, I don't, we're coming to the end of the time, we're just getting to the end of Berlin Dada, which is not really the end of German Dada even. But there was this big exposition. Here are some pictures of it. It was closed down by the police because there was a dummy dressed up as a officer, German officer with a pig mask on his face as part of it. Take Dada seriously, these signs and so forth. There was a kind of environment that they created at this time. Yeah. Let me just do at least Hanover, because it was a distinct form of Dadaism that happens there. It was called März, and the only member of it really is Kurt Schwitters. He tried to apply to Club Dada, but because he didn't have communist values, he was denied membership. So he decided he'd have his own Dada right there. And he really is the main 20th century collage artist. He takes both what Picasso and Braque had done and what Hausmann and Hook and the photomontage done into this new synthesis, where he combines sometimes photographic images like this image of the moon, I guess, or some sort of thing down here, with actual like baby cart wheels and little tickets and so forth. His house was filled with the stuff. And I hope you can see the organization that goes into this beautiful composition with very, very subtle colors and different textures of the detritus of society. He used to just collect things on the street. He had it all organized into different bins and so forth, and became really a pack rat of these sorts of things. It's almost as the und picture, the and picture, and, not terribly large, but poster size, and just really subtle and beautiful in a way that Berlin Dada isn't, with its more political propagandist message. This is more a poetry, kind of a street poetry, a poetry of found objects, of little, things thrown away, bus tickets and baby cart wheels and things all brought into a new kind of harmony that transcends their difference. So it's almost like he's taking the pieces of broken Germany and welding them into a new and idealistic unity on a kind of an idealistic level. His main work of art has been destroyed, as so much Dada art. He took his house and he had tenants upstairs renting from him, and he in Hanover, and he began to just build into his walls more and more and more things. Sometimes like there was a pillar in the center in which things had been buried. We don't know even what was in there because he just kept adding and adding and painting. And it's not at all chaotic. It has this really, it's an environmental sort of work of art. So Dadaism gives us both performance art, which is very big in the postmodern era of the last 25 years, but also installation art. It's an environment. The sculpture is its environment to which you walk. And after he filled up his whole living space with this kind of sculptural stuff, he then evicted the tenants upstairs, built holes and so forth, and continued what he called the Märzbau, or the März dwelling. März was his name for Dada because he was not allowed to use Dada after he was excluded from Berlin Dada, and fleeing, the Nazis burned down the Märzbau. They hated it, and they wanted to make sure nothing survived. He took with him these two big suitcases that were real heavy, and when he got off the train in London, or I think he emigrated to England. And one of the things burst open, and it was all full of collage stuff that went blowing all over the place, because this is what he had packed. These were the things that, besides his shirt and his, few things as he escapes, he takes all this collage material with him that he just can't bear to part with. And he started to build a new Merzbau in England, but then he died. And it's another one of these weird kind of lost things of the Dada period. I don't think we have time to do New York Dada, but there was, look at that profile of Marcel Duchamp. Maybe I'll mention just one piece, right? This piece, and then we'll close with this. Duchamp was an American, he was a French artist, but lived in the war in America. And that was also draft dodging. Instead of going to Zurich, you go to America, which is neutral at the beginning of the war anyway. And there was a society called the Society Anonyme. And then it was an avant-garde exhibition society that was sick of juried exhibitions that left out artists who were avant-garde. And so they decided to have exhibitions which are completely democratized. So anybody that called themselves an artist and paid a $1 entry fee could have a certain amount of space that they could put whatever they called art up. And just to make sure, as an anti-jury show society, just to make sure that the jurors didn't get clever in moving the artworks to more favorable and less favorable places in the exhibition hall. What was I saying? So you got this certain amount of space, and you had to you had to say pay your $1 and so forth, and you get in, guaranteed, no matter what, no jury, to alphabetical order. Well, Marcel Duchamp, who was kind of the toast of New York because he had made this kind of cubist piece called The Nude Descending a Staircase, which had made him famous, really, in America, or infamous. It's a wonderful painting. We can look at it later, but because he came from out of Cubist tradition, out of Paris. But so what he did is because he knew if he was actually on the committee, that he was a member of the board of the Society Anonyme that organized the exhibition. He was on the Haying committee. He was one that insisted that they just be hung alphabetically by the artist's last name so there would be no bias. So he was in on the committee. So he realized that if he submitted something under his name, they would of course put it in, right? So he decided to test how liberal the Society Anonyme really was by going to a plumbing fixture place downtown in Manhattan and buying a urinal, right? And it was from the Mutt, plumbing company or whatever, with porcelain urinal, turned it upside down, signed it R. Mutt, because he didn't actually make it. And he says he had a student had a colleague deliver it. So they wouldn't see him. So it would be an anonymous. And guess what? They did not show it. It was rejected, even though if you said you were an artist, it was okay. So what he was really doing is testing their true values there. And American, is much more removed from Europe. It had a different kind of view of the First World War, and Dadaism was more playful in America. But I just want to close with this short anecdote, which I think is wonderful. Marcel Duchamp died in 1968. In like 1970 or so, there was a big exhibition, a retrospective of Duchamp's work, because a lot of it was performance art and organizing exhibitions and stuff like that's hard to document. So he's one of the first Dadaists to really get the kind of art historical scrutiny that we now see of the whole movement. And so they brought the show was there. And during the opening, it said that at the Art Institute of Chicago, the opening was attended by the board members, and the members of the Chicago Art Institute Society or whatever, and all the students of the art school of the Art Institute of Chicago were invited to the opening. And one student, it said, came to the opening and peed in the urinal at the opening. and much to the horror of everyone. But I can't help thinking that the ghost of Marcel Duchamp, if it was present at this exhibition, surely would have loved that kind of a gesture, because making a urinal into a kind of hallowed work of art from the past is kind of absurd in itself. And so I think that Duchamp would have, in the spirit of Dada, would have appreciated that gesture of revolt. After that, because it gave people ideas, they always exhibited with, restraining things, so you can't get too close to it out of fear someone will try to redo this again. One of the things I like to do when I'm in the Museum of Modern Art, just to be silly, is to take this strange piece by Duchamp and just spin the bicycle wheel when no one's looking, because you get in a lot of trouble, because it's considered a high work of art. But at that time, Duchamp was kind of throwing these things out almost as gestures. So I know I've gone over time, but I wanted to give you kind of a flavor of Dadaism as it kind of appeared first in Zurich and then on the international level with these various different enclaves. It was Paris Dada, however, that really survived the war and transformed itself into surrealism. So at some later time, we'll come back and we'll talk about Paris Dada and how that laid the foundations for surrealism, which was largely built around research of post-traumatic stress disorder soldiers. Thank you for listening. I'm just trying to get to a blank screen. And we can open up for questions.